Tomb Raider was developed by Core Design and published by Eidos Interactive for the Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and MS-DOS computers in 1996, reaching audiences shortly after the release of the 3D platforming titans Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot. The Saturn version was released about a month before the other versions, causing the team to crunch for the sake of a late-struck exclusivity deal with Sega in Europe. After the recognition of a few bugs in the Saturn version, a few final tweaks were made for all subsequent releases. A port was also planned for the Nintendo 64, which would have taken advantage of the console's unique analog stick, but this version was scrapped after Sony received exclusive rights to the series moving forward. The game's initial concept, created by lead artist Toby Gard, focused heavily on a cinematic presentation and a 3D character-driven experience intended for the upcoming PlayStation console. Inspirations for the game's format came from the adventurous style of Ultima Underworld and the 3D character models of Sega's Virtua Fighter. The third-person perspective was chosen in contrast to the then very popular first-person view after the success of Doom in 1993, and the game's platforming design was heavily inspired by 1989's Prince of Persia. Pre-production began in 1995 and ran for 6 months before the team was expanded from 2 members to 6. Tomb Raider's full development period lasted 18 months and cost a budget of roughly 400,000 British pounds. The year before Tomb Raider's release, Eidos recorded a pre-tax loss of $2.6 million, which turned into a profit of $14.5 million within 1 year. The game's success also bolstered sales of the new PlayStation console and caused Tomb Raider II to be 1997's most anticipated game of the year, by which point the first entry had sold over 2.5 million units worldwide. Upon release, the game received universal praise for its graphics, level design, and atmosphere. Many gaming publications either nominated or awarded it with 1996's Game of the Year award among competitors such as Super Mario 64, Tekken 2, and Quake. Following Tomb Raider's success, Lara Croft also became a gaming and multimedia icon, even appearing in commercials for cars and food. However, Gard didn't like the fact that in marketing materials, Eidos focused on Lara's sexual appeal instead of her in-game characterization. Feeling as though Lara had changed too much from his initial concepts, Gard left during the production of the second Tomb Raider game, though eventually returned to contribute to the 2006 reboot Tomb Raider Legend, as well as the first game's remake, Tomb Raider Anniversary. He must have been onto something with his initial vision, because the first 2 games in the Tomb Raider chronology remained the most well-received entries until the franchise's second reboot in 2013. That being said, let's take a look back at this franchise's origins as we figure out what's so great about Tomb Raider. The concept art for the game's protagonist during Tomb Raider's initial pitch strongly resembled action film hero Indiana Jones, before being changed to avoid legal complications. Designer Toby Gard had actually intended to leave the choice of gender up to the player, with both a male and female adventurer available to select, though the complexity of modeling and animating 2 protagonists caused the team to scale down to only 1, and Gard's favorite, then known as Lara Cruz, was selected, deliberately against the request of Eidos Interactive to feature a male lead. Aside from traits pulled from Indiana Jones, Lara was also inspired by the British comic Tank Girl, as well as John Woo's action thriller film Hard Boiled. Lara's notoriously exaggerated physical proportions were deliberately chosen to create a caricature of female action icons. In this first entry, Lara was voiced by Shelley Blond, who was directed to deliver a non-emotive female James Bond-type performance. Before beginning their adventure, players can give themselves a chance to become accustomed to the game's controls, as well as get to know our main character a little bit, by visiting Lara's home from the main menu. The protagonist will invite players through a tour of various obstacle courses, while vocally guiding them through the controls. Our adventure officially begins in the mouth of an ancient tomb in Peru, as Lara searches for an ancient artifact known as the Scion of Atlantis. After some local wolves maul her guide at the entrance, Lara is left to her own devices to navigate the traps and naturally dangerous terrain ahead in order to find the artifact. The inclusion of temples, tombs, and pyramids had been a central foundation for the game's design from the start, with the team drawing inspiration from the ancient Inca, Greek, and Egyptian civilizations to represent several diverse cultures throughout the game's adventure. Just because Tomb is in the title doesn't mean this game has a somber presentation. It actually has a much brighter design than most adventure games that take themselves this seriously, with pops of bright green foliage or painted architecture to keep things from becoming too dreary and monotonous while exploring temples made of stone. There's a remarkable degree of variety on every surface within the game, despite its clear grid-based design. The intentional unevenness of the most basic stone structure, coupled with a patch of encroaching vines, made much more interesting rooms to look at than was even bothered in most games by 1996. Each temple features multiple impressively large rooms that are actually embellished by the limited draw distance, by having the size of each large area truly obscured by darkness until the player investigates more closely. The game's lighting isn't elaborate, but it does feel appropriate to the interior, cavernous environments Lara finds herself in, without impeding the player's ability to see. What limited lighting was possible on the PlayStation was often used to highlight specific key points in each level that may suggest an area for the player to investigate, or the existence of an obscured path. High numbers of animal enemies were included in the game, especially in early stages, in order to ground the player in an initially realistic universe before exposing them to more fantastical ideas as the adventure unfolds. The staff also wanted to avoid Lara killing too many humans without discretion, though at the same time, I also think it's a little odd for an archaeologist to have so little regard for the ecosystem she's exploring, though I suppose some compromises have to be made for the sake of enemy design, so we'll just chalk it up to self-defense. The initial concept for Tomb Raider also much more prominently featured combat before the platforming and puzzle-solving mechanics developed further to consume more of the game's focus. After that point, enemies were positioned more precisely for a more horror-like atmosphere rather than an explicit action-based thriller. This is probably one of the best systems for shooting in third person until Grand Theft Auto III nearly 5 years later. The gameplay clearly shifts between having a weapon drawn or not, and in certain instances, such as her signature dual-wielded pistols, players can control Lara just as smoothly, running and flipping without taking her eyes off the target. Every so often throughout her adventure, Lara will be ambushed by an archaeologist's greatest enemy, a rival archaeologist. Being one of the only other humans we interact with in the game, Pierre is also searching for the Scion of Atlantis, and will appear sporadically to harass the player with gunfire, as a stark contrast to most of the game's other attackers, which are animals that have to fight up close. If the player's unprepared or doesn't respond quickly enough, Pierre may prove to be a much more substantial threat to the player's progress than a gorilla you can incapacitate from 2 floors above. As opposed to most adventure platformers at this time, especially the few 3D options to exist, it's interesting that the environment itself is more likely to be the player's demise than an enemy or monster. Tomb Raider really gave the clearest sensation of look before you leap in a video game up until this point, because you do actually have to check what's just beyond that ledge in front of you before assuming you can freely jump into the unknown. In Super Mario 64, aside from the fact that the world isn't as explicitly designed to obscure things from the player's view, there also isn't as much reason to worry about missing any jump, even if it were to send you plummeting to your demise, because you can just try again. And what's losing a life when you've got 10 more to go? But in Tomb Raider, there are no lives, you just go back to your last save. Specifically on the console versions with their finite save crystals, taking bits and pieces of incremental damage from reckless movement can really add up, and cause you trouble before you manage to reach the next save point. Due to the fall damage received from taking on vertical drops beyond Lara's physical limits, the player may have to run through their bandages treating more sprained ankles than combat wounds. Speaking of, health items are often placed very specifically within the player's sight to draw their attention towards a secret area or perhaps climbable object that they may have overlooked without a highlight. Some health items are conveniently located in an area that the player is expected to have taken damage recently as well. Since a third-person 3D action-adventure of this scope had never been created, constructing a world that could be freely explored served as a difficult hurdle in the game's production. Eventually, programmer Gavin Rummery created a level editor in the game's engine, which allowed the team a breakthrough method to seamlessly stitch together the game's world on a grid-based system. Many of the challenges and traps in the game's earlier stages are simply meant to acclimate the player to the very novel concept of three-dimensional character control. While there are natural hazards, such as wolves and bats, the majority of quote-unquote puzzles follow the lines of cross these bridges without falling off, or get through this door before it closes, while not actually inflicting a great penalty on the player if it takes them a few tries. Later on, more thematic elements are added, such as making the player now jump over rushing water, which begins to make the platforming feel more exciting, even if the penalty is still nothing more than being sent back to the beginning of a segment to try again. As these challenges evolve, more genuine hazards are added and combined to create the cliff-hanging stunts that should be expected from an Indiana Jones-inspired adventurer. Basing the distance of Lara's jumps around the measurements of the grid-based level construction was a great way to give players more confidence in their actions, as they basically learn a set of platforming formulas involving the height and length of all of Lara's maneuvers, so that they know how to safely approach each gap and obstacle they're presented with. While she doesn't turn on a dime quite as easily as Mario, Lara still could perform far more acrobatic stunts than your average video game protagonist, with the ability to climb, leap, and shimmy in much more natural ways than we would see from most humanoid characters for several years. Lara's different animations, depending on the height of an object she's climbing or dropping from, are also really impressive. She has a different animation depending on whether she's climbing up to something at her hip or shoulder, for instance, and takes longer to compose herself the further she jumps down, even if it didn't cause any actual damage. The walk button keeps players from falling off the edge of a platform no matter how close they get. This feature was exceptionally far ahead of its time, despite its simplicity, and it gave players a chance to confidently explore their immediate area as they tried to best navigate more complicated structures. Pulling from one of the game's inspirations, Lara has a similar vertical jump to the protagonist in Prince of Persia, meaning every time the player jumps from a stationary position, Lara actually moves forward just a little bit. This makes narrowing in on ledges easier, as Lara does a finer level of tuning than you can get from the press of a forward button. It's incredibly helpful that virtually every button on the controller is purely focused on how Lara moves. Considering this was the next big step in the evolution of platforming games, and was therefore very complicated for its time, the developers did a good job of giving players plenty of options for fine-tuning their character's movement if they were willing to take on such a challenge. While the game uses the typical basic controls of walk, jump, and action, different buttons can be used to control Lara's speed, grip on a ledge, or, as I find most underrated yet significant, her ability to move backwards. Lara is fully capable of taking carefully measured steps backwards to set up for the next jump, while most early 3D games only ever allowed their character to move forward, usually requiring some sort of U-turn maneuver to back up before a jump. Otherwise, in other tank control games like Resident Evil, we were left with very robotic motions where moving backwards was more cumbersome than just giving the player a roll, flip, or other turnaround button. It's really impressive how little the player's control is interrupted at all in this game, even with moments like Lara unlocking a door with a key from her backpack. The game doesn't have to split away to a short cutscene or loading screen like the door sequence in Resident Evil. Even more impressive is how large many of the rooms are in each temple, while only really requiring loading at the beginning and end of each level. Personally, I think the save crystals are actually a very beneficial feature of the console versions of Tomb Raider. My first instance of playing this game was on the Windows PC version, and the ability to save whenever and wherever I wanted actually detracted from my overall understanding of how each level was stitched together, because I was too busy focusing on each individual hazard as I saved before and after every threat or precarious jump. On the console versions, however, aside from adding a decent degree of challenge and peril to the adventure, the save crystals also keep the player on track by indicating where the player may be trying to reach upon finding a new area, especially with some of the more vertically complex environments. In the levels that have more of a central area with branching paths, the crystals also help to keep track of where the player has and hasn't been as they loop back on their own trail in these puzzle-heavy dungeons. The game's music was written by Core Design's in-house composer, Nathan McCree, who cited his main inspiration as English classical music. In order to obtain a realistic choral sound in the strictly synthesized soundtrack, McCree would insert recordings of himself breathing to create the impression of a live recording. For each song, McCree was given a description of the intended setting and left to create the music for each area with no time for rewrites after his initial submissions. Unlike most games of this time, which featured continuous instrumentation, Tomb Raider generally implements musical cues at particular moments for dramatic effect. Otherwise, the player often only hears the sounds of Lara and her actions within the environment. The short music sequences that do appear throughout the game feel original and unique, rather than a John Williams knockoff in pursuit of that Indiana Jones influence. Instead, McCree's pieces focus more on an atmosphere of mystery than heroism. I feel like the only things keeping this historic title from being a must-play classic to this day would be the notable absence of a more continuously present soundtrack and a map system of any kind, both of which would prompt more focus, excitement, and sense of direction into this adventure that can obviously become a bit too listless whenever the player begins to have trouble solving a puzzle or finding the next hidden corridor. At an average playtime of 16 hours, Tomb Raider was actually much more of a lengthy adventure than many of its contemporaries as well. It may undershoot plenty of RPGs out there, but the majority of other games on the PlayStation and Saturn at this point were based in the racing, fighting, and sports genres, which usually kept the player's interest through very specifically curated forms of replayability. Considering how much of a standard presence they are in the gaming world at this point, it's hard to remember that this was a time when third-person adventures were quite novel. I mean, even the concept of cameras existing separately from the player within a 3D space was incredibly new territory, and unless you were playing something like a racing game, there often wasn't a reason to have your character directly in front of the player's field of view when you could just display from above, from the side, or so on. Honestly, at this point in time, first-person games were much more popular thanks to the success of early 90s games like Doom and Myst, as well as the easily understood perspective these games presented to consumers. In fact, the Tomb Raider series basically cornered the third-person adventure market until Nintendo gave the genre another jumpstart in 1998 with The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Until that point, most third-person style games on the Nintendo 64 were more heavily focused on platforming and amassing collectibles, such as could be seen with Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. And due to the limitations on PlayStation hardware, pre-rendered backgrounds and top-down perspectives still reigned supreme for the next few years, until the rise of Spyro the Dragon, Siphon Filter, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. But even so, these third-person games really didn't represent the truest sensations of adventure, quite like the journey players went on with Lara Croft. That is what's so great about Tomb Raider. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we leapt into the historic world of Tomb Raider. If you want to support the channel, make sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and do whatever else the algorithm demands of us to keep up with our favorite content. Also, consider being a part of the community on Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Zelda II: The Adventure of Link, on screen or in the description. And let us know your thoughts on Tomb Raider and what games you'd like to see in the future. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.